You are about to see Keith McHenry, founder of Food Not Bombs, speaking at the UC Santa Cruz Kresge Town Hall on Thursday, November 20th, 2014. The event was hosted by the UC Santa Cruz Common Ground Center, Education for a Just and Sustainable World. To find out more, visit kresge.ucsc.edu/common ground.
Thank you so much. Cool. So, wow, there's a lot going on here. So, first I would like to say that this tuition hike thing, that reminded me of how some of the things I did early on. I was in college, and I had a professor, Howard Zinn, who taught American history. And one of the big issues, is it too loud? Okay, cool. So one of the things that was going on was the tuition hike. They were going to do a 17% tuition hike at Boston University. And so I was involved in helping organize that with the Hedge School Collective, which Zinn was a part of, and we took over the board of directors or the regents meeting and chased them down the street to the president's house, John Silver's house, and did a lot of great things like that. It was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the tuition did go up. It was a private school. Then they tried to get rid of Zinn, and we organized in his support. And then after that, I actually came to Kresge and started hanging out with my hippie friends here, and eating mushrooms and all the stuff that people did in the 70s here with at Kresge. I'm sure that doesn't happen anymore. And it was really cool. And we were thinking of all these ideas, which you are probably reading about in the book Ecotopia. So we were imagining, I took classes, for instance, in college called Solar Living, where we discussed not only, the first lecture was 2 days about how the professor had been hired to do future market research for this consortium of companies like Fiat and Shell and stuff like that. And he decided after 10 years and nearly $500 million spent by those corporations that there was no future markets. That capitalism actually wasn't going to be going into the future because of the crisis of things like climate change. So this was predicted in the early 70s. He's teaching the class in 1976. So there's been people that have, the corporations, the leaders of these corporations have already investigated what it is that we are now talking about today. So our idea was to transition. Why just let the corporations destroy our earth, imprison us, do all the things that they're doing? We need to organize in some manner to change that. And so when I was an art student, I had a morning job as a produce worker, and I was throwing away all this produce, and I felt really terrible about it. I worked at one of the earliest organic produce stores called Bread and Circus in Cambridge. And so I started taking that produce down to these housing projects a couple of blocks away. And one day I'm talking to the people that were gathering the food. They said, "What's this brand new building across the street?" And they go, "Oh, that's Draper Lab. They're designing the guidance system for intercontinental nuclear missiles." And in those days, the United States was theoretically was preparing to blow up the Soviet Union. There used to be this country called the Soviet Union. It doesn't exist anymore. And we might be blown up by that country. So we had mutually assured destruction. And was the official policy of the two countries. And we decided, the 8 of us, that we would start to collect this food in an organized way and take it to all the projects in the community. And in those days, there was very few homeless Americans. Ronald Reagan had just been elected. It's 1980. So the real poverty at that point was people that were housed but living in public housing or in tenements, and they're the people that needed the food. So we were taking them groceries. It was unnecessary to prepare meals for people because they had kitchens. But the other thing we decided we were doing was trying to stop Seabrook Nuclear Power Station. And so at that time, I'm like 22 years old, and I'm going to this protest up at Seabrook, New Hampshire, and we're trying to take over the construction site before they bring nuclear materials there. And one of my friends, Brian, one of the original 8 Food Not Bombs activists, gets arrested. And so we want to organize fundraising events by doing bake sales. And we don't make any money. And as it turns out, that same time, we had a van and we had a moving company called Smooth Move. And we're moving this family, and they have this poster that says, wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed, and the Air Force had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber. And we thought, this is fantastic. So we go and get ourselves some military uniforms at the Central Square Army Navy surplus store. We go out with our baked goods and this poster, and we tell people that we really are generals, and we're trying to buy a bomber. Please help us out. Well, not too many people thought that was actually accurate, but it would at least catch their attention, and we start talking to them. So that gave us the idea of doing street performance with our food out on the streets. And so we, at that time, all 8 of us were going to all these meetings. So we, like for instance, at that time, the U.S. was at war in El Salvador. So we were going to the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador meetings and pledge resistance. Some of my friends were from Iran, so we're trying to overthrow the Shah of Iran. The Sandinistas were trying to liberate Nicaragua. There was a movement like through the solar, we used to go up to Goddard College and go to the School of Social Ecology and study permaculture and organic gardening. So we were go to meetings to promote community gardens, and then the draft was being proposed. So we were going to the meetings to stop, we were going to Boston Alliance Against Registration, the draft meetings, mobilizations for survival to stop the nuclear arms race and the new possibility of nuclear annihilation. So I was going to 1 meeting, 2 meetings a night. I was never out on the streets talking to the American public about these ideas, and so we decided, rather than just drive ourselves nuts going to meetings, talking to the same people over and over again about the same things, and just ignoring the actual need to change society by talking to the public, we decided we'd combine all those ideas: feminism, anti-racism, anti-homophobia, organic gardening, solar power, wind power, opposition to all these wars, a vegan diet, at that time called vegetarian, that we were promoting because we were influenced by a book called Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore Lepage. And so we were trying to connect to how the violence of capitalism and all of its different nuances, like exploitation of people based on race or gender and so on, were all connected to the exploitation of animals, to the earth, that it was all connected. And that the solution was to transform society so that people actually partially were resisting those things by going to protest and occupying buildings and so on, to stop what capitalism was doing. But there needed to also be a replacement of that system, and we wanted to participate in that dialogue and try to encourage as many people in our community as possible to transition to a sustainable future, where people would live in harmony. They wouldn't be exploiting one another. There would be an end to war and violence, and that people would work cooperatively. And so from the very beginning, we had all this information, and we're doing those kind of things on the streets. And then in 1988, I moved to San Francisco and decided to start a second Food Not Bombs group. And it was not too long after we started that a nice hippie came by and said, "Oh, wow, you can get a permit to do this." And oh, that's so cool. So we write a letter to get our little permit, thinking that it's the most liberal city in the United States. They're just going to love this Food Not Bombs thing. By now, there are homeless people living on the streets because it's 1980. It's 8 years of Reaganomics, 8 years of the economic principles of which the Koch brothers were even back then supporting. That neoliberal sort of Ayn Rand view, the Chicago School of Economics. What we saw, that was the coup in Chile in September 11th of whatever that was, 72, that whole thing was starting to become a reality in the United States, and therefore, when there was under 100,000 homeless Americans when we started in Food Not Bombs in 1980, there was now, the census was saying that there was over 750,000 homeless Americans. So this was becoming part of the urban landscape, and this effort to drive the homeless out of sight was starting to be institutionalized. Eventually, under Clinton, it becomes a thing called the Community-Oriented Policing Services, and a whole body of studies called Quality of Life Enforcement Program started up, which continues to this day. So this nice hippie asks us says, oh, you can get the permit, so we go write a letter for the permit, and lo and behold, on August 15th, 1988, 45 riot police come out of Golden Gate Park and arrest 9 of us for serving free food without a permit. And the next week, people are so outraged because there's a photo in the San Francisco Chronicle showing the riot police guarding the food from the hungry, and with this big headline, 9 volunteers arrested at Golden Gate Park. And so people start contacting us saying, oh my God, how can we help you? How can we get arrested feeding the hungry? This is fantastic. We want to join you. So we organize a meeting. We decide, well, okay, let's go next Monday at noon and do the same thing, see what happens. So about 150 people show up, and the police arrest 24 of us, and there was this new TV company called Cable Network News, and they showed up on the scene and they got video of this, and it was broadcast all around the world, and people were like, oh my God, they're arresting people for feeding the hungry in San Francisco, this is crazy. So we start getting phone calls and letters, and there wasn't email. And people wanted to know how they could start a Food Not Bombs in their community and get arrested for feeding the hungry too. And so we made a little flyer called 7 Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs, and we mailed that to you so you could get arrested in your town. And this kept going on and on. And after the first 94 arrests, the mayor said, oh, we'll give you a permit, so he could stop the arrest because it was starting to threaten his situation there. His name was Art Agnes. And so we're like happily going along. We now have so many volunteers. We decided to also share food outside the farmers market at Yuan Plaza and outside the Federal Building and so on. And then homeless people come to us and say, oh my God, we're like being brutalized by the police. They're trying to drive us out of the city. And we've seen those students in China. They're camping in the park at Tiananmen Square. We're going to do the same thing here in San Francisco, call it Tiananmen Square. And we are going to try to get the mayor to tell the police to stop attacking us and give us housing. And we occupied Civic Center Plaza for 27 days. And the mayor is so kind enough as to say, oh wow, we found a shelter for you. And that is abandoned Jaguar dealership on Polk Street. So with the help of the riot police, we pack up our belongings, we go to the new shelter. And unfortunately, you could have to leave your wife and children on the streets. It's only for single men. You can't bring your pets. You can't bring your belongings. And there won't be no food. So many people thought, wow, this is not actually the solution to homelessness that we were told it would be. So we go back out to provide meals twice a day in front of City Hall, where we start to get arrested again. And so we do this every day. We're arrested, we're beaten. There's like hundreds of people eating with us now. It's this whole crazy thing. And then one day, there is this huge earthquake while we're cooking dinner, and called the Loma Prieta earthquake, or the World Series earthquake. And we're like, wow, the cops will probably be real busy because of this earthquake. We'll just go down there and start serving some food and take our propane stoves from the Tent City protest, from the Tiananmen Square protest, and we'll set up, and it'll be cool. So everybody's coming. It's like a huge amount of people coming. We're now getting deliveries from grocery stores because the refrigerators are down, and we get a second tent so we can start stacking the food there. And but to our surprise, police come like we'd never seen before. It seemed like every patrol car and paddy wagon in town was showing up. And the cops are walking towards us, and we're like, oh my God, I can't believe they're going to arrest us like 2 hours after this earthquake. This is crazy. But instead of arresting us, they got in line with everybody else and had dinner. And this is, then they came for breakfast. They wanted to be first in line for breakfast, so they were there. And we fed them for 3 days, and that ended those arrests. But those arrests and that whole campaign inspired groups to start in Prague, Czechoslovakia, which became Prague, Czech Republic shortly thereafter. It was also in Melbourne, Australia, Victoria, British Columbia, Winnipeg, all over the United States. There was groups, was starting to, this whole little movement and of people organizing these projects, Food Not Bombs groups. And then there was another series of arrests all through under the next mayor, Frank Jordan. It ended up being a total of 1,000 arrests for feeding the hungry in San Francisco from 1988 to 1995. And during that time, though, we had 2 world gatherings in San Francisco. The first one was in 1992 in October, when Native people decided that they had 500 years of being conquered by the European community was enough. And so there was going to be a big Columbus Day celebration in San Francisco. Congress had voted to make San Francisco the official American city to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus discovering the world, the New World. So we decided we'd have 2 days of gathering before the Columbus Day protest. And during that time, we came up with this idea that what would bind all the Food Not Bombs groups together. And we decided not only the name and the logo, but that there would be 3 principles. And the principles would be that the food would always be free and vegan or vegetarian, and free to anyone, rich or poor, drunk or sober, without restriction. That the second one would be that there'd be no leaders or presidents or headquarters or directors, that each chapter would be autonomous and would use the consensus process to make decisions. And that's like very similar to the process that was used during Occupy, if you were familiar with that. And then the third thing was that we would not be a charity, but that we would be dedicated to taking nonviolent, direct action to change society, so no one would have to live outside and eat at soup kitchens and so on, that everyone would have all of the resources that they needed. And we could show this abundance, the reality of the abundance, but because we could get this huge amount of food and show up on a regular basis in San Francisco twice a day and feed like hundreds of people. So if we're doing this with unpaid people, the volunteers that are doing it cooperatively, where the homeless people themselves are participating in the meetings to help us make decisions on the logistics of Food Not Bombs, then it was obviously possible to solve the problem of hunger, poverty. All these issues could be solved. At the same time, we had our literature tables with all this information about all these ideas that we wanted to combine from the very beginning. We kept doing that. We also started to organize taking food. Like there was Redwood Summer was a really big action to try to save the redwood forest, and Food Not Bombs organized a base camp and provided food for the whole summer to the people that were occupying the trees and blocking the bulldozers. And so we did that kind of work. And then my first book I translated into Spanish. And so I went over to Europe and I met these anti-globalization activists there on my tour. And they were talking about how there was the World Trade Organization was beginning to institute these trade policies, and they were having these summits, and they were trying to shut them down. And we got to talking. We said, well, we should bring this idea to the United States and try to promote it here. And this is where I ended up starting to work with Victor, because we wanted to do this thing called the Unfree Trade Tour. And if you go on if you Google Unfree Trade Tour, you'll see that it says International Forum on Globalization, and a little painting I made to advertise that tour. And they gave us all this literature and supported us. And so for 60 days, we went around the United States and Canada, advocating that if the World Trade Organization ever had a summit in North America, we should all go there and try to shut it down because of the problems that would be caused by the WTO, and that we should show by example what the world is that we want to have and know could be happening, and the counter-example to this idea of corporate domination over our society, over our environment, over our ability to work, over our food, over our labor rights, over our human rights. So that 60-day tour went all over North America, and we got all these people signing up for it. We handed out literature from Jerry Mander's actual pamphlet. We gave copies of that everywhere we went. And afterward, about a year later, the WTO announces they're going to have a summit in Seattle in November of '99. And so everybody that signed up, by now we have email. although it was not like what we have today, but it was similar. We contacted everybody, we called people, we made flyers, we made posters for Not Bombs chapters, helped organize in cities all across North America. We worked with our allies in all this, in the labor and the environmental movement and human rights movement and poverty movements to bring as many people there and shut down non-violently through the Direct Action Network and a pledge of nonviolent resistance, the WTO, and disrupted it. And so that was sort of the early part, although we had been involved in supporting the Zapatistas and the work against NAFTA before that, but then Food Not Bombs started taking food to these anti-globalization protests, G8 protests all over the world. So now Food Not Bombs has got to the point where we're in over 1,000 cities. And Food Not Bombs has a lot of other projects that have spun off. So one of the earliest ones was Homes Not Jails, where in San Francisco, during the savings and loan crisis, which is the earlier version of the current economic collapse in 2008, we would go and write down the addresses of all the abandoned buildings in San Francisco, and this started up in other cities as well, this pattern. And then we would go to City Hall. In those days, you had to actually go and look and see who owned the buildings and whether it was, and oftentimes we found out a bunch of corporations or mortgage companies were suing each other over the ownership of these properties. So if that was the case, which was mostly the case, we would go and we would take off the locks that were on those buildings and put our own locks on them. And then at dinner, we would make an announcement and say, who here wants a free place to live? By that time, there was roughly 20,000 homeless San Franciscans, so you got a lot of popular support for a free house. And so we would say, meet us at 9 in the morning at this address, and we'll give you a free house. And they would come there. We would already start fixing it up. We provide supplies to help paint it. We provide them with a lease. We turn on the electricity. We turn on the water for them. And according to the book No Trespassing, we had keys to 400 houses, and we housed between 100 people in 100 to 200 of those houses at any given time. And then we also started a project called Food Not Lawns, where we would take over abandoned lots, and we would bring in all the community and say, let's start growing your own food. And of course, you might have seen a Food Not Lawns sign down on, I guess, Laurel. And some of the founders of Food Not Lawns lived here for a while. That was started by Heather Flores and her friends in Eugene Food Not Bombs, and now that is in hundreds of cities of the world. There was, we always loved what Adbusters were doing with Buy Nothing Day. So on Black Friday, we would do this thing where we would have a really, really free market. An idea started by Christchurch, New Zealand Food Not Bombs, where we'd give out free everything in the park as well. Not only food, but haircuts, massages, books, clothing, things like that. We came up with, we had anti-police brutality day that we helped found. We started this other project called Indie Media in 1995, where we, and some of the Food Not Bombs volunteers in Melbourne, Australia, figured out this concept of how you could upload audio, video, sound, and text files to the web yourself. Now they call that Facebook. That was invented by anarchists in Melbourne, Australia. We came up with so many. We were involved with Stephen Dunifer and others in the free radio movement. We had at one point over 400 pirate radio stations in the United States, unlicensed, amazingly creative. We still have one here. Freak Radio or Free Radio Santa Cruz. It still is sometimes on air for real, and sometimes it's just on in the Ethernet, but it can be anywhere. And so these projects are the kind of the solutions where we're taking back, we're reclaiming. There was a movement called Reclaim the Streets, but we were very involved in that. So Occupy was another version of reclaiming the public space and reclaiming the things that are basically that are already here. Why should the Koch brothers own the airwaves? The airwaves are here. We can know how. People like Marconi and others have already invented things like FM radio and stuff. Why are we letting corporations control those things? So these things are, now they're trying to make rules, and 60 cities in the United States have laws either banning or restricting the sharing of free food with the hungry. Right now we're being arrested, and other community activists and Food Not Bombs volunteers are being arrested in Fort Lauderdale in what's now this crazy wave where the corporations believe that they control and own our societies, and we're saying no. But the thing that's amazing is the amount of people that are thinking that the idea of privatizing the parks in Fort Lauderdale, of privatizing public space there, basically making it illegal to feed the hungry, when there's growing legions of people that are forced out on the streets through the banking foreclosure crisis and so on, these policies. Instead of jailing the bankers, they're jailing the victims, the homeless themselves. Now they're jailing the people feeding the people that have been forced onto the streets through these economic policies. And so people are like resisting. They're like protests all over the world against the city of Fort Lauderdale. When we were being arrested in Orlando, the same thing was happening. People were, Anonymous was blocking their websites and so on like that, in Disney World and so on. I'm sure that's about to occur in Fort Lauderdale. And so there is this huge amount of energy towards basically taking the spirit of which Ecotopia is talking about and trying to create it as a reality. And that, we see that with the resistance to the XL Keystone. We see that with the massive protests in places like Chile against tuition. They're demanding, the Chilean students are having these massive protests saying education should be free in Chile. And so I recall when I came to Kresge to hang out and eat mushrooms that my friends here were actually paying something like $12 a semester to go to Kresge. Are you paying $12 a semester? So it's in one human's lifetime that we've seen the tuition go from $24 a year to whatever astronomical amount you're paying now. So, we could, if they can, that transition can happen within one lifetime. Certainly in your lifetime, you could transition back to a time when your children are going to pay $12 to go to Kresge. So I encourage you to participate in these social movements and get involved in changing society. There's so many amazing projects. Now, my final thing to say is a lot of times I hear from people my age that, the students, they don't do anything, it's not like the 60s and so on. But the reality is there are people that are probably have a more nuanced and more sophisticated vision of the freedom that we were espousing in the 60s that became, for instance, the book Ecotopia, than we had in the 60s. Because a lot more is going on in the way society is organized, the access to information. But the thing is that we had CBS, NBC, and ABC in the 60s. So when you saw a student protest movement against the Vietnam War, you only had access to 3 channels. The people in power of the media learned something by the Vietnam War. Don't show students doing what they're actually doing. Hide that reality. And that's why they're trying to hide the fact that people are coming out to eat in the streets. The reason they're arresting us in Fort Lauderdale is they don't want pressure to actually reverse the ideas that the Koch brothers represent by seeing hundreds of people standing in line to eat. And instead, if they could just drive those homeless people to the margins of society, to out of sight and out of mind, then they can continue on their program of maximizing power, maximizing resources, and exploiting people and animals and the earth and the environment. And so the thing is, people do have this soul and this heart, and they're pushing back in a major way. And so that's what if you don't see it, it doesn't mean it's really not happening. It's actually this massive amount of organic gardens and food not lawns type of things, and every kind of project you can imagine, which is trying to transition the world. And this is everywhere. I've seen like organic farming movement in Ethiopia. There's actually young activists that are making an Addis Ababa composting system. You wouldn't think that's going on. And I was in Nairobi at a giant organic garden in the center of the city that's feeding hundreds of people. So these things are not just limited to schools here in the United States, there's students that are doing this in basically every corner of the world. And so you're part of really this massive global trend to move our community away from the kind of system that is creating climate chaos into one where our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will actually be able to live in that kind of world that Ecotopia is dreaming of. So, okay.